Aboard a Japanese fleet carrier, the weapons went on to the aircraft below decks, in a sealed steel room with no daylight in it, by a party of mechanics working to a written order. On the morning of the 4th of June 1942, one of those weapons was hanging under a Nakajima on the hangar deck of the Akagi. 200 miles northeast, 3 American carriers were already sitting in water her admiral had decided was empty. That torpedo had been fitted the evening before. It came off that morning, and nothing that happened afterwards ever put it back. The whole engagement can be told through it. What it was doing under that aircraft, why it was taken down, what took its place, and why the work could not be undone once it had started. The men who survived the morning gave a different account of all of that, and they gave it for 50 years, and it was wrong in the one place where being wrong mattered. Before the fleet sailed from the inland sea, the commander of the combined fleet gave Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo an instruction about exactly those torpedoes. Half the torpedo aircraft in the carrier force were to stay armed against ships at all times, held back in case an American fleet turned up at Midway. Yamamoto said it aloud, and it never went into the written operation order. 2 of his own staff officers, Kameto Kurashima and Yasuji Watanabe, said afterwards that they wished it had. Nagumo sailed believing the Americans did not know he was coming. There was a reason for that. As late as the 1st of June, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo was still telling the combined fleet that the American carriers were down in the South Pacific, and a Japanese search aircraft had seen the Enterprise and the Hornet east of the Solomons on the 16th of May. Nimitz had arranged for them to be seen, and then kept a stream of invented signal traffic running in that ocean after they had gone. Tokyo changed its mind on the 2nd of June. The Naval General Staff now thought the Americans had worked out the Midway operation and might be waiting with carriers, and it sent that judgment out as an urgent signal addressed to Yamamoto and to Nagumo together. Yamamoto received it. The Akagi did not, because she carried a small island for her size, and had no antennas long enough to take low-frequency, long-distance traffic, so a great deal of what the fleet flagship was hearing never arrived aboard her at all. Yamamoto assumed she was hearing it anyway, and his senior staff officer talked him out of passing it on the grounds that radio silence mattered more. Ryunosuke Kusaka, the chief of staff aboard the Akagi, had asked before sailing that the Yamato relay anything important across to them, and had been turned down. The most powerful carrier force in the world went out unable to hear the man who had sent it. So when Nagumo spoke to his staff a few hours before the first launch, he told them what the paperwork he had been given supported. The enemy did not know their plans. No serious force with carriers at its center was thought to be anywhere near. The morning began, the way that assumption said it should. At 4:30, in the dark, the 4 carriers put 108 machines into the air against Midway in equal thirds of dive bombers, torpedo aircraft, and fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. 7 aircraft went out on search lines across a wide arc to the east and south. It was a thin search by American standards. Nagumo was not hunting a fleet, though. He was checking a box. The weather did the rest. One of the 2 search aircraft off the cruiser, Chikuma flew almost over an American task force at around 6:30 and saw nothing at all, because the cloud below it was thick and low and unbroken. The other Chikuma machine never finished its line. It turned back at 6:35 with a storm sitting across its path. At 7 o'clock, Tomonaga came up on the radio from over the island to report that Midway had been hit, and that Midway was still working, and to recommend a second strike. At 7:15, Nagumo gave the order, and on 4 hangar decks the mechanics began taking the anti-ship weapons off the reserve aircraft, and fitting weapons meant for a runway and a fuel dump. The torpedo came down onto its trolley. What has occupied naval historians ever since is a narrower question than why Nagumo gave that order, which was defensible, and it is why the 20 seconds it takes to say the words could not be taken back over the next 3 hours. The first Americans arrived at 7:10, and they did not come from a carrier. 6 Navy Avengers and 4 Army Marauders, torpedo aircraft belonging to 2 different services flying off one island airstrip, went in against the mobile force with no fighters and no plan between them. 5 of the 6 Avengers went down. The 6th came home with its control surfaces shredded, its gunner dead, and its pilot and radio operator both injured. 2 of the 4 Marauders survived. Nothing was hit. The Japanese fighters that killed them had to be brought back down to the decks afterwards, because a Zero carried 60 rounds for each of its 2 cannon, and a Zero that is fought is a Zero that is out of ammunition. That is a detail about a fighter aircraft, and it is also the mechanism by which the battle was lost. At 28 minutes past 7, the number 4 search aircraft off the cruiser Tone found ships, 10 of them, steering southeast at better than 20 knots. The signal said nothing about carriers. From where that crew were sitting, there were no carriers to see. The signal took its time getting home. The Akagi was not guarding the search frequency, so the cruiser that had launched the aircraft took it in instead, in code, on a set whose operator was not standing by for it, and then passed it across to the flagship by lamp. Nagumo stated twice in his own report that it did not reach him until about 8 o'clock. Almost every historian who came after him threw that out, because the flagship's message log has him acting on it at 7:45. The Akagi's flag bridge log went down with the ship. What survives is a composite log that a staff officer named Chuichi Yoshioka stitched together from the signal logs of several ships, and Yoshioka wrote a warning into it that the entries were fragmentary and inconsistent and would not bear much weight. Whichever time is right, the work in the hangars ran on for a while. It could not have been undone in a hurry in any case. Nobody in the Imperial Navy had much practice at this. Changing a squadron of torpedo aircraft over from torpedoes to 800-kilogram land bombs had been tried once before the operation, as an experiment aboard the Hiryu, and it took an hour and a half to do, and 2 hours to undo. The 2 weapons had nothing in common. A Japanese aerial torpedo was long and slender and weighed nearly a ton, and the land bomb was short and thick. The ribbed rack on the belly of a machine that carried one would not carry the other, so it had to come off, and a different rack had to go on, and that alone ran about 20 minutes an aircraft. There were not enough trolleys to work a whole squadron at once. Each ship had enough wheeled carts with jacks on them to serve 1 division at a time, 6 on the Akagi and perhaps 9 on the Kaga, so the squadrons went through in shifts and the carts went round and round. A torpedo came down onto a cart, traveled to a rack, and stayed there. Then the rack under the belly came off. Then a bomb came up. All of it happened below, in the dark, because these ships were built with enclosed hangars. American hangars had roll-up sides and could be opened to the air. Japanese hangars were boxed in on every side by storerooms and workshops and crew spaces, ventilated by fans, with no way to clear exhaust fumes. So no aircraft engine aboard was ever warmed up below decks. Warming happened up in the open, for 15 minutes at the least, and there was no way around it. A radial motor taken to full power, cold will wreck itself. So a strike could not be built downstairs and then squirted into the air. Every machine had to be lifted one at a time, spotted, unfolded, chalked, warmed, briefed, checked, and then flown off. The deck was occupied for the whole of that, and a deck doing that cannot land a fighter. Which raises a second question, and it has nothing to do with torpedoes. It is about what would be standing on those 4 decks when somebody finally turned up overhead. The Americans, without meaning to, and without knowing they were doing it, spent the next 3 hours making sure that never happened. At 5 to 8, 16 Marine Dauntlesses out of Midway, under Major Lofton Henderson, found the Hiryu. More than half his pilots were too green to dive bomb, so they came in on a shallow glide instead, and the Zeros took Henderson on the second pass. 8 machines got home, and 6 of those never flew again, for 1 near miss. At around 8:15, 15 Army B-17s bombed the Hiryu from 20,000 feet, and put 68 tons of high explosive into the ocean around her without touching her. On the way through, they took photographs, and those photographs are the sole surviving pictures of any American attack on those carriers that day. At 8:20, 11 Marine Vindicators, aircraft so old the pilots made jokes about them, gave up on the big ships and went after the battleship Haruna instead, and missed her too. At the same time, the search crew off the Tone, still circling, still watching, sent the signal Nagumo had spent the morning being told he would never need. The enemy, they reported, was accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. That crew has been criticized by 3 generations of writers for the 52 minutes it took them to see one. The likeliest explanation is that there was nothing of the kind under them until then. Task Force. 16 had begun to string out during its own launch, and the 10 ships they had reported were the screening ships, several miles clear of the flat decks and under a thinner sky. They'd also cut their own search line short by 65 miles on their own initiative, which is the reason anyone found anything at all that morning, and having found something, they held station over an American fleet for an hour and a half at real risk to themselves, and sent back 7 signals in that time. It was careful flying. Nobody in that aircraft lived through the war to explain why they cut the corner. Now Nagumo had a decision, and no good version of it. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division, sent across a recommendation to attack at once with whatever would fly, and Nagumo turned it down. His torpedo aircraft were lying in pieces on the hangar decks. His Zeros were either up over the formation or down on the flight decks taking on fuel and ammunition, which left him nothing to escort a strike with, and his first wave was overhead, shot up and short of fuel. And the position he had been handed for the American fleet put it far enough off for him to believe their fighters could not yet reach him, which meant the Americans would either wait to come nearer or come without escort, and either of those suited him. The position was wrong. The search crew's navigation had put the American ships about 55 miles further north than they were. So he chose the thing his whole service was built around. He would take his aircraft aboard, arm everything properly, and send one enormous combined strike, dive bombers and torpedo aircraft and fighters together, off 4 decks at once. It was the method that had worked at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean and everywhere since. It had a single requirement, and the requirement was quiet time on the flight decks. The recovery began at 8:37 and ran until about 9 o'clock for the strike aircraft. At 9:17, the force swung to the northeast to run down the Americans, and the last fighter came aboard a moment after that. Then the carrier squadrons came, and they came the way the island squadrons had come, which is to say, in pieces. 15 Devastators from the Hornet at about 9:30 under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, with nothing over them and every one of them shot down. 14 more from the Enterprise a few minutes behind, also unescorted, and almost all of those shot down as well. 12 from the Yorktown at about 10:15, with a handful of fighters above them that could not save them, and they went the same way. Between the 3 of them, they made no hits at all. None of that was designed. Rear Admiral Spruance had wanted his squadrons to arrive together and attack together. His fighter cover got lost, or took the wrong heading, and his torpedo crews flew on alone and died for it. From the Japanese decks, though, the shape of the morning was simpler than that, and what it amounted to was a queue. Every one of those attacks put the mobile force into hard, evasive turns, which stops ordnance work in a hangar dead. Every one of them burned cannon rounds out of the patrol, which brought Zeros down onto the decks to reload, which took the decks. Marines, Army crews, a Navy detachment, and 3 carrier torpedo squadrons out of 2 task forces under 2 admirals, none of it coordinated with any other part of it, and all of it arriving. The mobile force had been built to fight one enemy fleet doing one thing at a time. What arrived instead was a morning of unconnected American commands, each taking a turn at it. At 10:20, the Akagi had just finished taking 3 fighters aboard. That is when the dive bombers arrived. 2 squadrons off the Enterprise under Wade McCluskey, and 1 off the Yorktown under Maxwell Leslie, none of them escorted, and none of them opposed, because the last of the Zeros had been dragged down to sea level by the Yorktown's torpedo crews, and there was nothing left upstairs. In something under 5 minutes, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi were all burning. What the men on those bridges spent the rest of their lives declining to say plainly is that the decks were nearly bare. Japan's own official war history, published in 1971, states that, at the moment of the attack, every one of those ships still had its strike aircraft down in the hangars. The machines up in the open were fighters, and on the Soryu, a few of them going up to reinforce the patrol. The photographs the B-17 crews took between 8 o'clock and 1/4 show. No strike aircraft on the decks of the Soryu, the Hiryu, or the Akagi, just a handful of Zeros. Lieutenant Richard Best, who led the 3 Dauntlesses that hit the Akagi, and who was looking straight down at her out of his dive, said the 6 or 7 machines on her deck were fighters, and that one of them was in the act of taking off. The strike was still below, fueled, half-armed, packed into a sealed steel box with no ventilation, and one way out, an elevator that took one aircraft at a time. That is also why 3 ships died in 5 minutes rather than burning through the afternoon. A bomb through a Japanese flight deck went into a closed room full of aviation fuel and loose ordnance. 9 years later, in Tokyo, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida published an account of the battle. Fuchida had led the aircraft at Pearl Harbor, and he was aboard the Akagi that morning, laid up after an emergency operation for appendicitis, unable to fly. In 1955, his book came out in English through the United States Naval Institute, and one passage in it became the most repeated paragraph ever written about Midway. At 10:20, he wrote, Nagumo ordered the launch, and on the Akagi's deck, all planes were in position with engines warming up. The ship began her turn, and within 5 minutes, he wrote, every machine she had would have been in the air. That number went into Samuel Eliot Morison, into Walter Lord and Gordon Prange, into the 1976 film, into a novel and a television series, and out from there into the general memory of an entire country. It is a magnificent line. What it does is set a whole battle on an interval too short for anyone to be blamed for it, a defeat handed down by fate rather than by judgment, in an honorable end for a navy that had just been taken apart in an afternoon. The paperwork those ships kept does not support any part of it. Nagumo's decks needed about 45 minutes of uninterrupted work to put a strike of roughly 20 aircraft into the air, on every deck, at the same time. 40 of those to lift and spot and warm and brief, another 5 or 10 to fly them off. That figure did not come from an American reconstruction. It comes out of Japan's own war history, which says flatly that even with everything armed and ready, it would take no less than 40 minutes to get them out of the hangar and finish preparing them. There is a fair yardstick for it as well. 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor, 6 carriers with no enemy anywhere near them needed 55 minutes to spot and launch a second wave of 171 machines. The Akagi had not held a clear deck for that long since 7 o'clock in the morning. Her flight operations for the day are a wall of small entries. Fighters off at 10 past 7, 1 down at 20 past, 1 at 26 past, 3 at 36 past, 2 at 10 to 8, 3 up at 8 past 8, 4 up at half past 8, the whole midway strike aboard between 25 to 9 and 9, 1 down at 10 past 9, 5 up at half past 9, 3 up at a quarter to 10, 2 down at 9 minutes to 10, 3 down at 10 past 10. 10 minutes after that last entry, she was on fire. Almost everything the world believes about that morning came from one officer, flat on his back in a sick bay, describing a flight deck he could not see. Sorting out that kind of thing means going through the paperwork the ships themselves kept, which is what this channel does. Subscribe if that is the version you would rather have. There is a real argument among historians about which clock ran out. Dallas Isom held that the decisive thing was the delay in getting that first sighting signal to Nagumo, and that everything followed from the extra 20 minutes of torpedoes coming off aircraft that could not then be put back. Jonathan Parshall, David Dixon, and Anthony Tully answered that the arming clock was never the binding one, and the flight deck was, and that Nagumo, far from standing minutes from a launch, had barely begun. Isom never conceded it and published a book of his own to argue the point. Both positions are still in print and still opposed. The material that would settle them, the flag bridge log of the Akagi, and the men who worked those hangars, went into the sea or into the ground a long time ago. What both sides agree on is that the decks were bare. The man who said otherwise had spent the morning on his back in the Akagi's sick bay. There is one more piece of evidence, and it is the cleanest of all, because it is not a document and nobody had to remember it. The Hiryu was not hit at 10:20. She was 10 miles clear, undamaged, with an aggressive admiral aboard who had wanted to attack for 2 hours, and every reason on Earth to get aircraft off her deck the moment the other 3 began to burn. Her first strike left her at 57 minutes past 10.